The night Robb Stark should have died at the Red Wedding, something shifted in the wind. A minor hesitation, a misstep. Maybe fate blinked. Walder Frey raised his cup that night, his face as false as the vows he broke. But as the music began to shift and the doors slowly closed, a sharp-eyed grey wind growled low in his throat, just loud enough to rattle Robb. Not trusting his gut had cost him before. This time he didn't wait. He stood from the high table, hand on his sword, and with a single shout, "To arms!" he flipped the table into chaos. Arrows flew, screams echoed. Catelyn Stark's voice was the last thing he heard before blackness swallowed him whole. He woke 3 days later, blood-soaked, bandaged, and breathing only because Blackfish Tully had returned earlier than expected and turned the slaughter into a standoff. Grey Wind was dead, and so were thousands of his bannermen. But Robb Stark was alive, and angry. The North declared him dead. Some had already begun to bend the knee to the Boltons. But Robb rode north like a ghost risen from the grave, broken men and vengeful hearts riding with him. He found the Dreadfort still drunk on victory, not knowing the young wolf would come howling again. He hung Ramsay Bolton from his own walls and burned Rose's body atop the rubble. The North had no choice. It remembered. They whispered of him now, not as king in the North, but as the wolf returned, the boy who cheated death and hunted traitors by moonlight. Robb didn't correct them. He didn't feel like a king anymore. He'd buried too much. It was Jon Snow who found him next. Word had spread like wildfire that Jon was Lord Commander now, that the Wall had seen things no man should. Jon came to Winterfell in the middle of a bitter snowstorm, dragging behind him a warning more dire than any. "Freyblade, the dead were walking and they were coming." Robb didn't believe it at first. The North had always told ghost stories, but Jon, he was different now, older, colder. His eyes had seen something too dark for boyhood. Then they brought in the white. The thing screamed like ice cracking. It took 5 men to hold it. Robb stared into those empty eyes and knew that everything else, battles, betrayal, revenge, it all meant nothing now. The real war was coming. He called his bannermen, not for vengeance, not for crowns, but for survival. Not everyone answered. The Karstarks stayed hidden. The Manderleys sent ravens, but no men. The Glovers outright refused. They had bled too much, for too many dead kings. But Robb Stark had been dead too, and come back not as a ghost, but as a general with fire in his veins. He did not beg. He gave them one chance, and those who refused he left behind. He and Jon stood side by side atop the walls of Winterfell, watching snow fall like ashes from the sky. They didn't speak much. Words were fewer now. In the dungeons, below, dragonglass was being shaped. Meisters worked by candlelight, and smiths forged blades with trembling hands. Every day brought new signs, missing villagers, animals found frozen stiff with eyes turned blue, and the wildlings whispering of a great cold moving south. And yet, for all the steel and fire they prepared, the war that was coming wasn't just about swords and snow, it was about trust. Jon had seen what Daenerys Targaryen was bringing, a queen with fire, dragons, and a will as sharp as Valyrian steel. But Robb Stark, born of old northern blood, had seen what kings did to the North. He didn't want another, and he didn't trust her. The dragons came before the queen. They darkened the sky above Winterfell, casting their great shadows over the snow-covered walls as the North watched in awe and fear. Robb stood beneath them, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword, resisting the primal urge to flinch. Even Jon, who had already seen them up close, looked uneasy. Fire in the sky was beautiful until it turned toward you. Daenerys Targaryen arrived not long after, wrapped in furs finer than most northern lords had ever seen. She was regal, proud, and her army marched like they already owned the land they walked on. The Unsullied, the Dothraki. These were not allies used to sharing command, and Robb Stark was not a man who liked bending the knee, especially not to someone who reminded Him too much of every Targaryen story old Nan had ever whispered. The first meeting was cold. She offered no apology for arriving uninvited. She simply looked at Robb and said, "If we are to survive, you will need me." He didn't bow. He didn't even blink. "And what do you need from me?" he asked, his voice like the crunch of ice underfoot. "Your loyalty." "My loyalty died with my bannermen at the Twins. What I offer now is alliance, not allegiance." Jon tried to ease the tension, stepping between them like a bridge made of snow, ready to collapse under too much weight. "We can't afford to fight amongst ourselves. The Night King is moving." But already the air between Robb and Daenerys crackled with something deeper than politics. Distrust, ego, grief. Fire and ice rarely mixed without blood. In the days that followed, the North bristled under the presence of foreign soldiers. The Dothraki laughed too loud, rode too wild. The Unsullied stared too long. The Northerners muttered of invaders. They still remembered Aegon the Conqueror, and dragons had always meant death to them. Robb kept his men close, his counsel closer. He spoke often with Jon, but less with each passing day. There was a distance growing between the brothers, shaped by choices and loyalties neither could fully explain. Arya returned from the shadows like a ghost with a blade. Sansa watched everything with careful, judging eyes. She and Daenerys clashed early. Two queens without thrones, but too much power to be ignored. And Bran, Robb barely recognized him. His youngest brother no longer looked at people. He looked through them. He spoke in riddles, stared at flames, and muttered about timelines and mistakes that hadn't happened yet. Robb tried to talk to him once, alone in the Godswood. "What do I become?" Robb asked quietly. Bran's reply chilled more than the wind. "You become what the North needs. And that is not always a king." The first sign of the dead came 2 nights later, a village 30 miles east, burned, frozen and silent. No screams, no bodies, just blue-eyed corpses standing in the ruins waiting. Robb led the scouts himself, and returned grim-faced. He'd seen war, but never like this. No rage, no fear, just cold, relentless cold. Jon urged him to send ravens to every corner of Westeros. "We need more men, everyone. Lannister, Martell, Tarly, house names don't matter now." But Robb shook his head. "Too many promises, too many debts. I'll not trade one leash for another." "You'd rather die than ask for help." "I'd rather die free." Daenerys overheard them. She stepped between the brothers, her voice sharp. "Then you'll doom us all. I did not cross the narrow sea to watch men squabble over pride while the world ends." Robb turned to her, his eyes fierce. "And I didn't survive betrayal and slaughter to kneel to another conqueror." Tyrion, watching from the corner of the room, muttered into his wine, "We may freeze to death before either of you figures out who's got the larger crown." Winter was deepening. The wall had already fallen. Refugees trickled into Winterfell. Each day, fewer every time. The dead were close now, too close, and still the living fought each other with more passion than they fought the coming storm. But the Night King was watching, waiting, and his patience was as endless as the cold. The snow was falling harder now. Thick, heavy flakes blanketed the fields outside Winterfell, muting sound and smothering the world in white. It had a way of making things feel calm, like the stillness before a funeral. But Robb Stark knew better. That kind of quiet didn't mean peace. It meant something was coming. The scouts didn't return that morning. Neither did the second group. Just silence. Then the horns blew. 3 long blasts. The sound tore through Winterfell like a blade. Robb was on the battlements before most had dressed. Jon was already there, Ghost by his side, eyes fixed on the horizon. Daenerys stood with them moments later, her coat unfastened, face pale and drawn. From the trees they emerged, the dead, thousands of them, a wall of white, blue and bone stretching across the plains, silent, still, unblinking, the kind of army that didn't chant or cheer. They didn't need to. Their presence was enough to unravel even the strongest stomach. And leading them stood the Night King, unmoving atop a dead horse, his crown of frost shimmering under the pale light. No battle cry, no warning. They simply charged. Robb shouted commands, voice like thunder. "Archers, loose!" The sky filled with fire-tipped arrows that rained down on the dead. Some fell, most didn't. The Unsullied formed their shield wall with brutal precision. The Northerners held the flanks. Jon and Robb rode together with the cavalry, blades drawn, dragons screaming overhead as Daenerys dove in on Drogon, setting waves of the dead alight. And yet they kept coming. Every time one fell, two more seemed to rise. Robb fought like a demon, covered in gore, screaming orders, dragging wounded men back to the line himself. His sword moved like it had a will of its own, cleaving through skulls, severing limbs, never stopping. Beside him, Jon moved quieter, quicker, a ghost with a blade of fire. They'd grown apart in words, but on the battlefield, they fought like the brothers they'd always been. Still, it wasn't enough, not even close. By nightfall, the dead had breached the first wall. Winterfell was no longer just a castle. It was a tomb in the making. Inside, panic spread like wildfire. Women and children were moved to the crypts, believing the ancient stones might protect them. Sansa directed the effort, face calm, but eyes distant. Arya disappeared, blending into shadows, a whisper of death waiting to strike. Daenerys circled again and again, Drogon roasting hundreds at a time, but even dragons grew tired. Viserion, now undead and ridden by the Night King, appeared just before midnight. His scream cracked the sky as he slammed into Drogon mid-flight, sending both crashing down behind the walls in a roar of fire and frost. Robb reached them first, barely able to see through the smoke. Drogon lay wounded, wing shredded. Daenerys crawled from beneath him, dazed. Robb grabbed her arm, yanked her to her feet. "You can't die here," he growled. "We lose you. We lose the fire." She didn't argue. For once, the Queen followed his lead. They retreated to the keep, dragging wounded men behind them. Tyrion stood near the great hall doors, with a dagger he didn't know how to use, looking as if he'd already given up. Bran sat beneath the heart tree, eyes white, lost in some vision. The roots pulsed with a strange light, the air around him, colder than even the snow. Arya stood guard with the hound, neither speaking. There was something about Bran now. He didn't blink, didn't breathe like the rest, as if he wasn't entirely human anymore. By the second night, Winterfell was cracking. The dead breached the inner walls. Wights climbed over the battlements, like insects, pouring into courtyards, tearing through steel and flesh without pause. Robb saw Lord Cerwyn go down screaming. A Glover boy, no older than 10, was dragged into the snow, and somewhere amid the chaos, he thought he heard Catelyn's voice. He didn't look, he didn't dare. Jon shouted for retreat, calling for regroup at the Godswood. Robb hesitated. Every part of him screamed to fight, to hold. But even he knew what death looked like when it had already won. They fell back, and, in the crypts, the last horror waited. The dead had been buried there for thousands of years, and now they were waking up. The dead did not knock. They broke through stone with hands like ice and rage. In the crypts beneath Winterfell, screams erupted as the walls trembled and dust filled the air. Sansa stood frozen as she watched the first of them crawl from the graves. Brittle bones wrapped in ancient skin, eyes glowing with cold fire. Stark ancestors, long buried, now risen against their blood. No one ever expected the dead to rise. Inside the castle, little girls screamed, mothers clutched their sons. A wildling tried to swing a hammer and was gutted in one strike. Chaos erupted. Sansa grabbed a dagger of dragonglass from the pile Jon had left. She wasn't a fighter. She'd never been. But she wasn't going to die like this. Not hiding, not without doing something. Arya appeared like death itself, leaping from the shadows with her blades gleaming. She moved so fast the whites couldn't track her. Bone cracked under her boots as she danced through the crypts like a silent flame. Sansa stood back to back with her for one terrifying moment, both covered in blood and dust. Above, Robb Stark was soaked in snow and red. His left arm had been sliced through to the bone, but he didn't feel it. Not yet. His sword was chipped, his shield lost. His men, his last, were dying all around him, but they still fought. Jon reached him in the Great Hall. "We need to fall back to the Godswood," Jon said, out of breath, blood on his brow. "Bran, he's the key. That's what this is all for. The Night King is coming for him." Robb nodded, jaw tight. He glanced around at what remained of his army, dozens where there had been thousands. "We hold him off," Robb said, "as long as we can." "No," Jon replied. "You're coming with me." Robb shook his head. "This war doesn't need kings. It needs time." Before Jon could protest, Daenerys landed with Drogon outside the shattered gates, flames carving a path through the undead. She leapt from the saddle, face streaked with sweat and smoke. "The Night King is close. He's coming. He knows." There was no more time. Jon ran toward the Godswood, Ghost at his side. Daenerys followed on foot, wounded but unyielding, and Robb turned toward the breach. He gathered the last of his men, Tormund bleeding from the scalp, Sir Davos limping but armed, Brienne still standing like a stone pillar of fury. Even Theon, eyes full of guilt and grit, stepped forward beside them. None of them expected to live, and they didn't care. They formed a wall at the gate, dragonglass in hand, shields up, shoulders tight. Behind them Winterfell burned. Before them the Night King walked. Robb saw him then, his face blank, mouth unreadable, cold eyes locked on the Godswood. He didn't speak. He didn't raise his sword. He simply looked, and the dead surged forward again. The last stand began. Blades clashed. Arrows flew. Fire roared. It was a storm of violence, a blur of bodies, heat and frost. Robb fought until his vision swam, until his sword felt like stone, until he could barely tell if the blood on his face was his or someone else's. He watched Brienne fall, dragged down beneath 5 whites. He saw Tormund slam a giant skull with a war cry, only to be gutted seconds later. Theon screamed and lunged at the Night King, only to be tossed aside like ash on the wind, and Robb kept fighting. He killed until he couldn't lift his arm, until the Night King was only 20 feet away, until the cold began to seep into his bones, and he knew he wasn't going to see the sunrise. But then everything stopped. A scream. Sharp and short. The Night King turned, and Arya Stark, flying through the dark like a shadow on the wind, slammed dragonglass into his chest. Silence, crack, shatter. He exploded like glass under pressure, and the dead fell, all of them, at once. Robb dropped to his knees, sword falling, beside him. He didn't speak. He couldn't. He just knelt in the snow, surrounded by corpses and ashes, the fire from Winterfell casting an orange glow over the blood-soaked frost. It was over, but peace did not follow. The snow didn't melt after the war. It only grew heavier, as if the sky itself mourned what had been lost. Winterfell stood, but barely. Its walls were blackened with fire, its towers cracked, and its courtyards soaked in frozen blood. The dead were burned in great pits outside the gates, their ashes carried by the wind over the north. The living stumbled through the ruins, hollow-eyed, silent, no singing, no celebration, just the sound of dragging feet, the clank of broken armor, and the soft crackle of smoldering wood. Robb Stark hadn't spoken in a day. He stood at the battlements where so many had died, one arm in a sling, the other wrapped in bloodied cloth. Arya sat below the Godswood, sharpening her blade with mechanical, empty motions. Jon tended to the wounded. He didn't look anyone in the eye. Daenerys paced through the great hall like a caged beast. They had won, But they hadn't. Not really. Tyrion said it best that night, when they finally gathered for council, what was left of it. "No songs will be written about this," he muttered, sipping wine with trembling fingers. "There's no glory in surviving the end of the world." Sansa arrived late, blood still under her nails from helping dig graves. She sat beside Arya, who hadn't spoken since the Night King fell. Bran remained in the shadows, watching with that strange blankness that unsettled everyone. When Daenerys stood, all eyes turned. "We faced extinction," she began, voice calm but sharp. "We bled, we burned, we endured. Now we must rebuild, and that means uniting the realm. No more north, no more south, one kingdom." Robb looked up, his voice hoarse. "You mean under you?" "I mean under someone who survived what none of the other rulers ever could, someone with dragons, strength and vision." He leaned forward, eyes tired but piercing. "And if the North says no?" Daenerys didn't blink. "Then the North will break itself trying to stand alone. You saw what happened. You know we can't afford division again." Jon spoke up finally. "Enough. We just buried half the realm. This isn't the time." But the cracks were already showing. The North had followed Robb through fire and frost. He was no longer a king to them. He was a legend, the young wolf who rose from betrayal, who fought the dead and lived. And the South, it had no king, no army, no real power. Daenerys had brought the fire, yes, but Robb had bled beside them. Loyalty in the North didn't change with speeches. It was bought with sacrifice. Robb had paid in full. The next morning, ravens came. Word spread like rot. The Vale had no lord. The Reach was fractured. The Iron Islands were already declaring independence. The realm was crumbling and no one was strong enough to hold it together, except maybe two. And they hated each other. Jon tried again to mediate, to build a bridge between Robb and Daenerys. He pulled Robb aside near the broken weirwood tree. "She's not your enemy." "She doesn't have to be," Robb said quietly. "But she will be. You feel it too. She saved lives, Robb. She expects payment. And what do you want? To rule again after all this?" Robb's silence was answer enough, but it wasn't about a crown anymore. Not really. It was about who the North trusted when winter came. And though Daenerys had dragons, armies and fire, she didn't have the North. That night, Robb visited the crypts alone. He passed the broken stones, the shattered tombs, the scorched remains of ancient Starks. He stopped before his father's grave, what was left of it. "They said I'd never live long," he whispered. "Maybe they were right. Maybe I should have died at the Twins." But he hadn't, and now he stood at a crossroads more dangerous than war. Peace, because peace brought politics, and politics, he knew, killed more people than any blade. They came in the night, quietly, without banners, a small party of unsullied, armed, disciplined and cold as the snow they marched through. At first, no one questioned it. Daenerys had ordered extra patrols since Winterfell fell into chaos. Too many mouths to feed, too many eyes watching, too much silence pretending to be peace. But it wasn't patrol. It was a message. When they reached the Eastern Tower, where Glover men still held post, they didn't speak. They simply entered and executed the Northern Guards. No warning, no trial, just blades in the dark and blood on stone. By dawn, the tower was flying Daenerys's banner, the Targaryen dragon in red and black, bold and unapologetic. A claim, a challenge. Robb was in the courtyard when he heard. The report came from a bleeding boy, barely 16, who had escaped by slipping down an old chute in the tower's kitchens. He could barely speak through the shock. They killed them, for no reason. No one even fought back. Robb didn't react at first. He just stared off at the snow falling past the broken ramparts, jaw clenched, eyes unreadable. Sansa was furious. Arya disappeared entirely. No one knew where she'd gone. And Jon John looked like he'd been split in two, torn between the woman he loved and the brother he followed through death. "She had no right," Sansa hissed. "This is still the North. She cannot take our land like this. This is conquest." Robb didn't answer. He didn't need to. Later that night, he went to Daenerys, alone. The guards let him through, barely disguising their unease. The queen's chambers were warm, too warm, lit with dragon fire and filled with the smell of smoke and scented oil. Daenerys stood by, the hearth, her white hair glowing gold in the firelight. "You killed my men," Robb said. She turned slowly. "They defied a direct order. The tower was strategic. I claimed it. They were northerners, defending their land." "No," she said coldly. "They were rebels. You haven't declared loyalty. Until you do, this is occupation, not alliance." Robb took a step closer. "So that's it? We kneel or you burn us. I burned cities to save people from worse. I crossed the world to fight death. I brought dragons, armies, sacrifice, and no soul," he snapped. She blinked, just once. His voice dropped hard and sharp as a blade. "You want to rule a kingdom of ash and ice? Then keep killing, but don't expect me to follow. You're not king anymore." He leaned close, his breath fogging in. The warm air. "Then stop treating me like one." He turned and left, slamming the door behind him. The next morning, the North turned. House Reed declared for Robb. House Mormont followed. The Ricewells, the Hornwoods, even the remaining Umbers, all swore loyalty not to a throne, but to the man who had bled for them. And Daenerys. She moved. Her forces to the East Gate, separating her army from the Northerners. Tension choked the air like smoke. One spark, and it would all burn again. Jon met Robb near the stables. "I can't choose between you," he said, eyes hollow. "You're both right, and both wrong." Robb just looked at him. "Then you'll have to decide which truth you can live with." Jon nodded once, slowly, then walked away. That night, Arya returned. She came through Robb's window like shadow and wind, no words, just a scroll. He opened it. It was a letter from King's Landing, from someone neither of them expected. Tyrion. "The South is breaking. Come now, before she claims it all." Robb folded the letter, his hands steady. This wasn't over. It had just begun. The snow turned to rain by the time they reached the neck. A wet, miserable downpour that soaked the banners and muddied the road. But it was almost a relief. After months of ice and fire, the rain felt human, unforgiving, uncomfortable, but real. Robb Stark rode at the front of a host unlike any the South had seen since Robert's rebellion. Scarred men, half-starved but loyal. Northern banners held high. Reed scouts slipped through swamps like ghosts. Mormonts marched in silence. The Yaf Starks were moving south again, and this time they weren't asking permission. Behind them, Winterfell held strong but tense. Sansa remained to rule in Robb's absence, and Arya vanished once more. Daenerys hadn't tried to stop them. Yet. She was too busy consolidating what she could. She'd sent ravens to Dorne and the Vale. Promised titles, lands, marriages. Some replied, most didn't. The realm was tired of promises. But Tyrion's letter had changed everything. He had escaped the capital after Queen Cersei's death, an event suspiciously timed with the wildfire cache exploding under the sept of Baelor. Some said it was rebels, others whispered it was Tyrion himself. Either way, the South had no queen, no council, just chaos. And in the heart of that chaos waited an opportunity. Jon hadn't followed Robb. He'd stayed behind. Robb hadn't asked him to come. There were no more pleas, no more chances to mend what had cracked. They were brothers, but sometimes blood couldn't cross belief. And Robb didn't know if Jon's silence was love or betrayal. In 3 weeks, they reached the edges of the Riverlands. Riverrun opened its gates without resistance. Blackfish Tully had returned from the shadows and declared for his great-nephew the moment he saw the northern banners. Old soldiers crawled from hiding, farmers offered bread and meat. Robb walked through the castle where Catelyn had once laughed, and swore to never lose another battle on its ground. But peace was a lie. On the third night it happened. The camp was quiet, fires burned low, rain had slowed. Robb was in his tent with his map spread, marking the path to King's Landing, when the scream came. He grabbed his sword and bolted. The guards were already running. Flames burst from the center of camp. Men shouted, horses reared and broke lines. Robb followed the sound closer until he saw it. 3 tents were burning, and inside the largest, Tormund lay gutted, throat slit open ear to ear. Brienne knelt beside him, still breathing, but barely. Her side was pierced with a spear tip snapped off in her ribs. Blood soaked the grass. It wasn't a raid. It was sabotage from within. Robb searched the camp personally. His hands trembled not with fear, but with rage. They found a dead Manderley guard with a poisoned knife in his boot. No sigils, no confession, but the message was clear. Someone didn't want Robb to reach King's Landing alive. That night, Blackfish approached his tent. His face was grim, his cloak soaked. "You know what this means," he said. "She's moving behind your back." Daenerys? Or someone who serves her, or fears what you'll become? Robb said nothing. He stared at the candle's flame, watching it flicker. "She's bleeding this realm dry already," Blackfish added. "And if she takes the throne, she'll never give it up. Fire doesn't share." A raven arrived the next morning, another letter. This one was unsigned, but the words were unmistakable. The Queen rides for the capital, with dragonfire and justice. She means to rule alone, burn what won't kneel. Choose now, Wolf, before you stand in her way. Robb read the letter 3 times, then burned it. He turned to his captains and gave one order. "We ride for King's Landing, at dawn." The roads to King's Landing were lined with ash. Entire villages abandoned, crops left to rot, trees blackened from old fires. People had fled the capital days before. Those who could. The ones left behind would either kneel or burn. Robb Stark stood on the last hill before the city gates, his army stretched behind him like a wound across the land. The Red Keep loomed in the distance, untouched, proud, and soaked in its own history of blood. They had arrived too late. Daenerys was already inside. Drogon had come first, torching the outer defences with a fury no ballista could stop. Then the Unsullied, less than before, but enough. Her flag flew from the ramparts, bold and final. But the city wasn't celebrating. It was quiet, afraid. And then the gates opened, not to surrender, to challenge. A single rider came through, armor gleaming, face grim. Jon Snow. He dismounted halfway and walked toward Robb, alone. Robb didn't move at first. He just stared. Jon stopped a few feet away and looked up, as if all the weight of the world sat on his shoulders. "You can't take the city," Jon said softly. "Not like this." "I'm not taking it," Robb replied. "I'm saving it. She's not the enemy. She killed my men in Winterfell, sent assassins into my camp, burned half the Riverlands just to prove a point. She's trying to rebuild the world. She's already started destroying it." Silence stretched between them, the kind of silence that once meant brotherhood. Now it meant war. "I have to ask you not to do this," Jon said. "For everything we've been through. For the realm." Robb stepped closer. "And I have to ask you something, too. If she ordered Drogon to burn us right now, would you try to stop her?" Jon didn't answer. That was the answer. Robb turned away. "I'll give you till sunrise to get your people out. After that, I come through the gates." Jon didn't argue. He just nodded. He looked like a man being pulled apart at the bones. That night, Robb didn't sleep. He sat by the fire, staring at the flames, hearing every scream from Winterfell, seeing every body buried in the snow, every child frozen stiff in his people's arms. He didn't want revenge. He wanted peace, but not Daenerys's kind. At dawn, the horns sounded. Robb mounted his horse, his sword strapped to his back. Beside him rode what remained of the North, hardened, grim, ready to die. They approached the gates and found them open. No soldiers, no unsullied, no resistance, just silence. And a path. Robb moved carefully, blade ready. He reached the Red Keep by midday, the courtyard still slick with soot and blood. The doors were open, and inside, at the foot of the throne, stood Daenerys, alone. Her eyes were rimmed with firelight, her dress singed, her face hollow. "You came," she said, voice raw. "You killed my men," Robb said, "turned the realm to ash. I gave it a future. You gave it fear." Her hand drifted toward her side. Robb noticed the slight twitch, the way her fingers curled, but she never drew her blade, because Arya was already behind her. No words, no sound, just a quick, silent breath. And then Daenerys collapsed, a thin line of red across her neck. Robb stared. Arya vanished again into shadow. It was over. Jon arrived moments later, out of breath, face white with horror. He saw her body, saw the blood. He didn't ask who. He knew. He didn't speak to Robb, didn't look at him. He just walked away, down the long black hall of the Red Keep, and was never seen again in King's Landing. That evening Robb stood before the Iron Throne. He didn't sit, he burned it. They said he watched the flames for an hour before leaving. Said he ordered no new king, no queen, just lords and people and councils. They said he returned to the north, never taking a crown again. But in the stories, he became something else, not king, not conqueror, but the man who ended the war of fire and frost, the last wolf, and maybe the only one who truly won.